Charles Joy has family roots in this town going back to before the Revolution. So he's maintained his local heritage, returning to this region religiously every year. In Virginia, where he serves as an Episcopal priest, Charles has been the rector of 2 different parishes over a 30-year period. And now he continues as a priest in parish at St. Eustace's Church in Virginia. But for us, here at Gouldsboro Historical Society, Charles has been a mainstay since the late 80s for our historical work and our perspective on this region's past and its past history. He started by creating an index, a much-needed index for the history that we published of the 19th century called Historical Researches, enabling us to find things in that book, which was published in 1905. He continued as a consummate researcher in archives all over the U.S. and also in the UK, which has borne fruit after the 90s, as he became our star lecturer for the Down East history that we all want to know about. He began with scholarly accounts of the Scudic region's founding fathers, the first people who set up and he branched out to regional history and events during war and also economic growth. And then he went on to talk about Maine's prominent artistic figures such as Sarah Orne Jewett, or Marsden Hartley, and Mary Ellen Chase. So he has a broad cover. And now we have this book. 2014, no, not 20, what I'm talking about, 2020, right in the height of the plague. It got printed, and a lot of you have bought a copy. And some of you who might not have bought a copy, we're here to sell you one, and you might collect the author's autograph if you're interested. So it's been my great pleasure to work with him editorially on this. It's really endeared me to working with Charles. And with that momentum, he went on and he wrote another book, this time on Ephraim Wales Taft, who was the land agent for the proprietors, and he became a prominent townsman of the mid-19th century. So this book that he's written is a thorough review of our region's growth and maturity during the height of the 19th century. And I hope to help a little bit with some publication of this. So today, Charles offers an in-depth examination of our state's distinctive identity. So let's hear from him, our lecturer, Reverend Charles Austin Joy.
First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the style of what I did, because I love history. It's my great avocation. And I find a lot of people, they say, oh, I hated history in school. It's all about dates. But the thing is, it isn't all about dates at all. All history is about people. And they're people like us. They just lived in a different time, did different things, but they're like us. And the dates that terrified school children over the years are really the skeleton on which the flesh of human life has been hung. So, first of all, we're not tonight going to be looking at date, event, leading up to 1820. That you can figure that out on your own if you want. But the remarkable thing about Maine's culmination as a state in 1820 is the long history, very varied, very complex history, and it's been a real challenge trying to sort some of this out in such a way that you won't be bored silly. that you'll be able to see patterns and purpose and plan as we go along. So it's about a wider reality than just a series of dates that lead up to a particular thing. So we're not talking tonight so much about the specifics of history as we are themes of history that brought, it was a very peculiar arrangement if you think about it. You look at a map of the United States and it looks almost like a jigsaw puzzle. And the pieces of the puzzle are the states, and they all fit together, and they're all connected to each other. Each one is a state, each piece is a state. But in the remarkable thing, before 1820, Massachusetts was one state divided and cut in two by another state. So there was one state in two pieces, which we never think about. But it was just kind of weird. And so that's only part of the story. So let's begin then. The old professor lay dying in deep pain from acute peritonitis. New England was weary of the winter and was slowly struggling up March Hill towards spring. The year was 1882. The old professor was born at Portland, Massachusetts, in the District of Maine. At this point, for more than 50 years now, the state of Maine. And when he died, all of Boston, all of Portland, all of the English-speaking world would shortly mourn the death of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, dying at the age of 75 in his lovely residence, the Craigie House in Brattle Street in Cambridge. His career had been as professor of modern languages in Harvard College, but his fame, international in scope, was made through his voluminous poetry. He was the only American whose bust is in Westminster Abbey, and his work was cherished by English-speaking people everywhere, by those as diverse as Queen Victoria, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Prime Minister William Gladstone, Walt Whitman, and Oscar Wilde. Though he had lived the majority of his life in the outskirts of Boston, Longfellow never forgot or diminished the origin of his identity. Born and raised in Portland, in old age he wrote a poem which contains lines to his birthplace and expresses his connection to and lifelong affection for his native state. Often I think of the beautiful town that is seated by the sea. Often in thought go up and down the pleasant streets of that dear old town. And Deering's woods are fresh and fair, and with joy that is almost pain, my heart goes back to wander there. We start off tonight with Longfellow because Longfellow is a bridge figure. He is an interesting intersection between the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where he lived in adulthood, and the state of Maine, the erstwhile uneasy part of that state. Following his death, his great friend and fellow poet, Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, wrote a heartfelt tribute to his dear friend and internationally honored colleague, and he called it Our Dead Singer. It begins, "Pride of the sister realm so long our own, we claim with her that spotless fame of thine, white as her snow and fragrant as her pine." Sister realm. So the creation of Maine's statehood in 1820 was not an event isolated by itself, but was really only the final event resulting from a multitude of complex political relationships, intermingled since the 17th century. So instead of the series of dates, cause and effect leading up to the separation, tonight we take a broader sweep of time through 3 centuries. And so we'll focus not so much on the final result in 1820 as on some of the forces that led at last to that conclusion. The deep interrelationship among people and events, leading at last over 3 centuries to statehood for Maine, brought about that major change. These complexities in state and national politics and sociology at the end of the period swept the District of Maine toward separation from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to become a sister realm. Well, volumes have been written about the period, and there's one right over there, and events that issued in Maine statehood. And it's impossible, really, it's so complex and complicated, to compass in one evening's talk the detail and complexity of that drawn-out process. So this paper is going to be based around the number 3. It will examine 3 historians who represent and express major milestones in the long evolution of the geography of Maine from its earliest settlement in the 17th century to its culmination as a state in 1820. And taken together, these 3 historians reveal much about the changing realities and new perceptions as the decades passed. So as a way of grasping important threads in this historical complexity, there are 3 subjects that I will use. There are 3 centuries, there are 3 wars, there are 3 historians. And these, I hope, will focus our thoughts on the long process that led at last to statehood in 1820. It's a little bit like if you have pictures of your children. If you have children, you have pictures of the children. So you have a child, and you have a picture of the child when the child was 5. And then you have another picture of the child at the age of 12. And then another picture of the child at the age of 20. It's all the same child, but they represent different aspects of the child's life and development. They're all the same child, and yet very different. So first of all, we're going to look at the centuries. We're going to look at there are two wars, actually 3 wars that are really important, 3 wars. And the first one in the 17th century was the English Civil War. Now you might wonder, what does that have to do with Maine? Well, here it is. We're used to thinking of the United States as a block, as a unit, as one thing. The Civil War was fought over that and ascertained that it was all one single unit. We're used to thinking in that way. But as the English colonies were established one after another in North America, there was no official interconnection between any of those colonies. None. Each colony had, as it were, an umbilical cord stretching from the colony to London. London was the reality. London was the heart of the empire. London was the capital that provided life, support, and sustenance for the colonies in the New World. So as the 17th century moved on, the conflict grew more and more between the Crown and Parliament. Parliament was largely represented by the Puritan movement in the English Church, which of course was the basis of the whole settlement of Massachusetts. They were Cavaliers and Roundheads, Royalists or Parliamentarians, Anglicans versus Puritans. The king was Charles I. And finally, in 1649, the king was beheaded on Tower Hill, as the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, had been beheaded 3 years before. And England became a Puritan protectorate under Oliver Cromwell. So you have 2 opposites striving together in the English Civil War, And it has profound effect on the American colonies, because the American colonies are connected, each one by an umbilical cord, to the Great Mother in London. Maine was originally settled, it was granted and settled to an English nobleman called Sir Ferdinando Gorges. And his title was Knight of the Durham Palatinate and Lord of the Province of Maine. What today is called York was then called Gorgiana, named for him. It was to be the capital. There was to be a whole organization of English government. There was to be a cathedral. There was to be a bishop, all planned out. Unfortunately, the settlers came one by one, by one, by one, in kind of an unorganized, disorganized way. Massachusetts, on the other hand, derived from the work of John Winthrop. John Winthrop was not a member of the nobility. He was a Puritan lawyer in London. And whereas the Maine settlement under Sir Ferdinando Gorges, representing the crown and the throne and the tradition of the royal government, had settlers who came one by one, by one, by one, by one, the great Puritan Hegira that came to Massachusetts in the 17th century ended up with 30,000 English people who were Puritan by conviction, who came to Massachusetts and became settlers. A big difference, a very big difference right there. So the war in England defeated the royals, and it was the defeat of the royals and the death of Sir Ferdinando Gorges at the same time that meant Maine was just sitting there, kind of these poor little people just kind of fluttering around. The umbilical cord was badly damaged. On the other hand, the Puritans, represented by John Winthrop in Massachusetts, had won the war, and so now it's possible for the Massachusetts government, the bigger government, the stronger, better organized government, to go up and take control of Maine. So in 1652, the government of Massachusetts accepted the submission of the town of Gorgiana, renamed York, and then in 1691, with the crown restored, King William gave a new charter to Massachusetts, which included the territory of the state of Maine. I hope it's very complex. It's very different from anything that we're used to, but I hope that that's clear because it's important. So the war defeated the royals and made it possible for the bigger colony, under the blessing of the parliamentary Puritan government, to take over and absorb Maine. And the two dates that are of significance in that process in the 17th century are 1652 and 1691. So by 1691, Maine was not an entity on its own anymore. It was just completely a part of Massachusetts. In the next century, the 18th century, there were two wars that are of great importance. England and France, from very early days, had been enemies, and there would be periodic battles and wars. And so in the middle of the century came what was called in England the 7 Years' War, and in America was called the French and Indian War. It lasted from 1756 to 1763, when peace was declared. Now, why is this war important in our story? Well, it was that war that ended French power in North America, because the British won the war, and the French had to cede all of their North American possessions to Britain. So, the ancient menace of the French and the Indians along the frontier that had been in Maine doesn't exist anymore. Up until the French and Indian War, the boundary of the British Empire in New England ended at the Penobscot River, and everything east of the Penobscot River belonged to France. Well, now it no longer belongs to France. It now belongs to England. And so now, people who had pull in Massachusetts went to England, and the territory from the Penobscot River to the St. Croix River was ceded to Massachusetts. All this territory here was all French and now became English. And so it ended the French power that had threatened the Maine settlements against which they were buffer from Massachusetts, and conveyed all of eastern Maine, including what is today Gouldsboro, to Massachusetts, and opened, therefore, a brand new frontier for new settlers. So the settlers started pouring in immediately into what today we know as Down East Maine. That's the First War. The Second War, of course, and the Great War that made the difference, was the Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. The Revolutionary War ended the power of the Crown in the North American colonies, which had provided, as we saw, provided the only unity there really was among the colonies, because the colonies were not connected to each other except as English-speaking people, each one connected by the umbilical cord to London. Well, now London is no more. And so here are all these little former individual colonies floating around with no connection really to each other. And so the question comes, what is to take the place of the Crown? What kind of authority will happen now? So, one of the things that happened in fighting that war was that a huge debt was accumulated by Massachusetts. And remember now, they owned all this land in Maine. The land in Maine had been a buffer against the French and Indians that they valued highly because that left Massachusetts itself alone. Well, now that's over with, but now Massachusetts is right on the verge of bankruptcy. So they turn their attention then to the Maine lands, these infinite, endless timberlands in Maine, a financial asset. And so at the end of the Revolutionary War, they developed land lotteries. Now, out of this double victory over France, the ancient enemy, providing the acquisition for Britain of lands east of the Penobscot to the St. Croix, producing a fresh frontier for Massachusetts to settle, and the war won over Britain in the Revolutionary War, the ancient mother, a major upending of society leading to wide discontent and great financial hardship. So the population of Massachusetts, which up until then had been very predictable, very stable according to the Puritan patterns, now is just uprooted and upended, and mass confusion in all kinds of places. So there is century one, the 17th century, the 18th century. The 19th century, which will be, as you can see, the 3rd century of Maine's life, saw the permanent dissolution of one single state in two parts and led to Maine and Massachusetts as sister realms. But everything that had gone before contributed to this very complex story. There are 3 historians whose work marks a progress from the colonial image to the state image. At one time, the first governor of Maine was a man whose name was King. And at one time, I thought about calling this talk From Crown to King. And then I thought that was just a little precious for what we were trying to do, so I didn't call it that. So the 3 historians that we're looking at are Thomas Hutchinson, James Sullivan, and William Durkee Williamson. We'll look at each one. Each book is significant in its title. And then I'll talk a little bit about each author and then read you a little bit of what the authors say that give an indication of the way they view the relationship between Maine and Massachusetts. These books are over here on this table. The first 2 are Hutchinson. The single one beyond that is Sullivan. The 2 beyond that are Williamson. So Thomas Hutchinson, his book was titled, it's in 2 volumes, The History of the Colony of Massachusetts Bay, from the first settlement thereof in 1628 until its incorporation with the colony of Plymouth, province of Maine, etc. Its incorporation. Volume 1, published in Boston in 1764. Volume 2, now, is the history of the province of Massachusetts Bay from the charter of King William and Queen Mary in 1691, which was the second of the 2 dates that confirmed that Maine was now a solid part of Massachusetts, until the year 1750. published in Boston in 1767. So both of these are published in what is still the colonial period. And notice by the second volume, the name Maine has disappeared completely from the title, completely submerged in Massachusetts. Well, who was this author, Thomas Hutchinson? Thomas Hutchinson was born in Boston in 1711, and he died in London in 1780. He was royal governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay. He was called the most important figure on the Loyalist side in pre-revolutionary Massachusetts. He was a native son. He was a graduate of Harvard College. Undoubtedly, he was an acquaintance and a colleague of the Jones family, Nathan Jones of Gouldsboro, who lived very nearby in the town of Weston. And like the Joneses, Thomas Hutchinson supported the British government in the imposition of colonial taxes, which in the end sparked the Revolutionary War. Now, Volume 1 of his history, which is right there, was published in the year after the Peace of Paris, ending the French and Indian War. So in the first year that Britain owns the territory beyond the Penobscot River to the St. Croix, this first history is written by the royal governor. The year following Volume 1, in 1765, Hutchinson's home in Boston was ransacked by a mob in order to protest the Stamp Act that had recently been passed by Parliament, and multitudes of historical records that Hutchinson had collected were destroyed, as he notes in his introduction to Volume 2. In 1774, he was replaced as royal governor by General Gage, a general of the British Army, and Hutchinson left and returned to live in England until his death. He deeply, deeply loved the history of his native place in Massachusetts, where he was born, and where his family had been involved since the earliest days. And yet, he had a still greater loyalty to the Crown of Great Britain, which at the time, of course, was the legitimate government. In 1764, the year of Volume 1, the region then known as the province of Maine was part not only of the colony of Massachusetts Bay, but also, therefore, an integral part of the British Empire. And that volume, Volume 1, the upper one right here on this end, was written just as Britain won the 7 Years' War against France, and eastern Maine from the Penobscot to the St. Croix was conveyed to Massachusetts. Now that the ancient French and Indian danger was removed, settlers in multitude felt newly safe to pour into those lands newly opened to British settlement. That's right here. That's us. So what about the work itself? And now I'm going to read you just a little bit of Hutchinson's own words, and listen for the way he loves his native place, but his ultimate loyalty is to the crown. Quote, "The new settlers of Massachusetts Bay were in perils also from their own countrymen." Now, this is in the 17th century. Sir Ferdinando Gorges, with a view to the advancement of his fortunes, had expended large sums for little purpose in attempts to settle colonies in New England. Read Maine. And then he says, "May the wealth and power of Britain still increase in proportion to the increase of her colonies. May those privileges never be abused. May they be preserved to the latest posterity." And his final words, "Great Britain is the state from which we sprang and upon which we still depend for protection. May it justly expect to be distinguished by us, and that we should delight in and contribute to its prosperity beyond all other parts of the globe." Thus, our first historian, the royal governor. Now, the second historian that we look at, that's the single volume with the map open there, is a man called James Sullivan. And his title is "The History of the District of Maine." Now, for the first time, Maine as a territory, though part of Massachusetts, is separated in thinking for its own history. This book was printed in Boston in 1795, and if you've been to Sturbridge Village and you've seen Isaiah Thomas's print shop, it's Isaiah Thomas's press that printed that book in 1795. Now, the name Sullivan should be fairly familiar to everybody around here, and with good reason, because James Sullivan, born, as it was, in Berwick, Massachusetts, now Maine, in 1744, and died in Boston in 1808, was the brother of Daniel Sullivan of Sullivan. This book was published in the same year that General David Cobb moved to Gouldsboro to become land agent for William Bingham. James Sullivan was educated at home. He was educated as a lawyer and studied law with his older brother, who was a lawyer. Now, he writes his book, The History of the District of Maine, 30 years after the Royalist Hutchinson. And after the earthquake of the Revolution, the government at all levels in the former colonies of Great Britain was finally being congealed and reorganized as a new country to meet a new day. No longer Crown and Parliament, and yet not yet a United States. James Sullivan became the 7th governor of Massachusetts, as Hutchinson had been governor of Massachusetts. And it was during his term that he died in office. He was a judge. He served as the Attorney General of Massachusetts and was much involved in the transition from British rule to independence and everything that involved legally. He was a member of the Democratic Republican Party, which was Thomas Jefferson's party, and very controversial among the powers that be in Massachusetts. And he was also the founding president of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Now, what does he say in the work itself? These are his words. Speaking now of Maine. This extensive country is so large and populous, and its situation so peculiar it cannot remain long a part of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But the difficulty of fixing on a seat of government and that of traveling from one part to another of the extensive territory, and the reluctance which the inhabitants of the western part have to going further east on governmental concerns, will for a while prevent a separation from the western part of the state and retard the commencement of a new government in the northern part of North America. But whenever its people can agree upon and procure a separation, it will give an energy to their public conduct and a spirit of enterprise to their private exertions, which can never be produced by any other means. And while we lament the prospect of losing part of our civil society and suffer under the disagreeable apprehensions of being deprived in some measure of the advantage of our political acquaintance with so many good and valuable characters, we rejoice in the anticipation of that elevated prosperity and high degree of importance to which the district must, from its peculiar advantages, be finally raised. So he's a transition figure. Governor of Massachusetts, he recognizes Maine as part of Massachusetts, but he also can read the writing on the wall, and that is not, he says, going to last forever. Now the third one, that's the 2 volumes next along over there. The title of that one, brand new, The History of the State of Maine, from its first discovery, AD 1602, to the separation, AD 1820. The first 2 historians were published in Boston. This one was published in Hollowell, Maine in 1839. William Durkee Williamson, born in 1779 at Canterbury, Connecticut, died in 1846 in Bangor, where he's buried in Mount Hope Cemetery. After William King, he became the 2nd governor of Maine. He was a graduate of Williams College in Massachusetts and Brown University in Rhode Island. Early in the 19th century, he moved to Boston as a young lawyer. He began law practice in 1807 at the age of 28. He saw the British sack Bangor in the War of 1812. He was representative from Maine to the Massachusetts Senate, where he joined the movement pushing for Maine statehood. See, it's growing all the time, growing all the time. After 1820, he became the third president of the Maine Senate, then governor. He was a member of the National House of Representatives in 1823. He became judge of probate for Penobscot County. He was an original member of the Maine Historical Society in 1822. And there on the table at the end, I have a letter of his. They're very hard to come by. It was written on the 8th of July, 1811, from Bangor to his honored parents, writing with affectionate tenderness. He says, "It is high time some renovation was made in our judicial and political system." So what about that work itself? Well, this is what he says about now in this newly minted state. An authentic history of this state has been long and much desired. Maine is a corner pillar of the American Republic. We live in a most favored age for improvement. In the present aspect of this state, there is prevented every motion to excite patriotic sensibility and enthusiastic emulation. The prodigious vicissitudes within 60 years next before separation, that is, all the ups and downs from 1760 on, through which this eastern country has been called to pass, have exhibited the inhabitants in all the forms of struggle and contest for existence, for shelter, for food, and for freedom. An era is now unfolded to the enjoyment of unenthralled religion and advancements in education and the arts, interests which form the chief glory of community and of man. In the visitant or traveler, surprised to find with what rapidity the forest has been cultivated into cultivated farms and populous towns, to behold how the myriads of savages are reduced to a few feeble clans, the objects of mere compassion, whose appalling yells so lately reverberated through the wilderness, and whose merciless revenge so boldly and unsparingly slaughtered the numerous recruits of settlers and demolished their houses and strongholds. Then may a future enterprise show that we consider the work of improvement and true greatness only commenced. A vast domain of nature still remains uncultivated, and attainments in literary and moral refinements are yet in the outer court of perfectibility. In the march of intellect, therefore, let science and practical skill be put to experiment, what may serve to develop the resources of matter and nature, so we and ours fulfill the destiny appointed us of making strong and solid the pillars of our country's greatness. There are the three historians. Hutchinson celebrates the past as a part and outgrowth of the British Empire. Sullivan celebrates the new present created by the Revolutionary War. And Williamson celebrates the future as the newly minted state of Maine. So finally then, here we are, and what about Gouldsboro and beyond in the midst of all this wide streaming information? Maine had been the buffer against the French and Indians until the Peace of Paris in 1763. That's one thing. Massachusetts had been nearly bankrupted by the Revolutionary War. Thing two. And the vast Maine lands provided a resource of economy, both by lottery and by sale. And here enters William Bingham of Philadelphia, who bought the Penobscot Purchase, 1 million acres, for more than $300,000, including this. In 1795, the same year that James Sullivan published The History of Maine, General David Cobb was hired by his friend William Bingham to come to Gouldsboro as land agent, manager of his estate. In the same year, 1795, Ephraim Wales Taft was born in Weston, Middlesex County, Massachusetts. In the very same month, the month of March, James Sullivan published The History of the District of Maine, As early as 1797, Cobb had looked forward to the advance of the District of Maine as the future unfolded. He said, "The character of this country is rapidly increasing in the estimation of the people of Massachusetts and Connecticut." Well, clearly that raises the value of it. If the people in Massachusetts and Connecticut are thinking well of it, that obviously is a proof that it's a good thing. "You hear of its good qualities in almost every village to the westward, where a few years since it was execrated. I have ever had my doubts of any great advantages arising to this district from its independence, and these have increased since I have been more acquainted with the inhabitants of the country. Not optimistic about Maine as a state." At the General Court in Boston in June 1817, passed a resolution which says in part, "The District of Maine shall be formed and erected into a separate and independent state." And in 1820, the same year that Maine became a state, General Cobb left Gouldsboro forever and moved back to Taunton in Massachusetts proper. His son-in-law, John Black, took the agency, and he finally, in several years, left Gouldsboro and moved to Ellsworth in 1827, where he built the Black House Woodlawn. In January 1828, he offers the Gouldsboro agency to Ephraim Wales Taft, who was then 32 years old, a product of the new Maine. Born in Massachusetts proper, his family was part of the exodus to Maine from Massachusetts at the end of the 18th century. Taft grew up a citizen of Maine, and in Gouldsboro he became a town leader and served in the Maine legislature. General Cobb goes with the old Massachusetts and its province of Maine. Taft rises with the newly minted state of Maine. Taft was the fruit and example right here in Gouldsboro of the Maine transition from province and district to state. It's new management for an old role. Cobb had been land agent for 25 years since the year Taft was born. Taft would be land agent in Gouldsboro for half a century until his death in 1873. At his death, Maine was about to be ushered into a brand new age, the age of rusticators in vacation land. Colony to province to district to commonwealth to state to sister realm. In some ways, the overthrow of the old government of Crown and Parliament in the Revolutionary War is reflected in the story of Maine, emblemed by these three historians. A new government, but always with recognizable continuity with the old. The 19th century that saw Maine statehood was a crucial time in our history. The 40 years from 1820 to 1860 struggled with the question, what will the promise of freedom in the American Revolution mean? And the Missouri Compromise, by which Maine entered the Union as a free state to balance Missouri, a slave state, was called by none other than Thomas Jefferson a fire bell in the night. Both states, born out of the core deep conflict that issued at last in civil war. It was during that exact period of time that Ephraim Wales Taft, now virtually unknown, unhonored, rose to leadership in many aspects of the life of Gouldsboro. He is largely unknown and very much underappreciated. So that brings me to the end of this, and so the way I want to conclude this is by looking forward. And I envision this as the first of a trilogy next summer and the summer after, if I'm still in the land of the living, which I hope I will be, but anyway, so this would be the first of the trilogy. Sister Realm, Maine becomes a state. And then next summer, I would like to do Ephraim Wales Taft Revisited, 19th Century Society, which is how society in a new state took shape and how it functioned. and how it worked on many different levels as it moved toward the future. And then the third piece of the trilogy, which would be 2 years from now, would be the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company, the wave of the future. And people, say, well, Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company, that's Winter Harbor, that's not us. Excuse me, it was us until 1895. And so when the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company was put together, it was given that name for a very good reason. It was in the town of Gouldsboro that it happened. And so the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company takes everything that we've talked about tonight, everything that I hope we can talk about next summer, and propels it into the future to where we are even now, in a time when tourists and vacation land and summer people are a very, very significant part of Maine economy. So we will have gone from the 17th century, Sir Ferdinando Gorges, to the present time with the summer people. Do you have any questions about any of this? I have over here, this is, I call this show and tell. These are Hutchinson's history and Sullivan's history and Williamson's history. And then if you're interested in all the icky-picky little minutiae about becoming a state, this is the authoritative book, if you can get hold of this. It has everything in here from A to Z, or A to Z plus or something, anyway. It's in there. And then right here, there's two things that these are just sort of symbols or metaphors, I guess. This is a photocopy that hangs in my study in Virginia of a document that is actually in the archives of the Maine Historical Society. And this is the proprietors of the tract of land on both sides of the Kennebec River. And this is a grant of land to David Joy of Richmond, farmer. And it's signed with his signature right here, which is why I love it. I am the 7th generation descent from David Joy, and he was the one who came around here. He was here by 1770 when he made a deed that is in Wiscasset, and it begins, I, David Joy, yeoman, of a place called Number 4, eastward of Union River, without the bounds of any township, in the county of Lincoln and province of Massachusetts Bay. So that gives you a sense, it gives you a feel of what it was like, how empty the land was, how vague the land was. And then the other thing that I have here, this is a letter written at Bangor, July the 8th, 1811. This is the letter that Governor Williamson wrote to his parents. And it's addressed here on the back to Captain George Williamson, Woodstock, Vermont, where the parents were then living. And it's a fascinating letter. And you can see it goes all on the inside. He was a young lawyer when he wrote this. And it gives a really, see, it's before Bangor was burned in the War of 1812. And he was practicing law there. And it gives you a really, it gives you a very clear feeling of the way society was developing, the way it was picking up, the way people were getting excited about the organization. And that's exactly the kind of movement that Ephraim Wales Taft gets caught up with in Gouldsboro. So these are, you're welcome to look through these if you'd like. Does anybody have any questions? Or are you all thoroughly, totally confused? Are you completely confused? Would you like me to give you a quiz about all of this? What does that mean, yes?
How do you spell gorgeous?
Spell what?
Gorgeous.
Oh, gorgeous. It's Gorges. Gorges. Sir Ferdinando. Some people think he was Italian. He was not Italian. He was English. Yeah. Sir.
So how did New Hampshire sneak in between Massachusetts and Maine?
Well, New Hampshire in the 17th century, there was a man called John Mason who worked with, he was a close ally of Gorges. And so Maine originally was going to be called New Somerset. and next to it was going to be New Hampshire, the two counties in England that were connected to those two men. But it was a completely separate thing, and it was kind of back and forth. New Hampshire was back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And finally they were able to assert their independence from Massachusetts. But I mean, it's the most peculiar thing in the world, a single state with another state. You have to go through another state to get to the other side of your own state. I mean, people don't think about that. You know, they don't realize how weird that was. But so because it was really, I mean, New Hampshire was really a lot more like Maine in its foundation than it was like Boston or Massachusetts. But it held out longer, and then gradually, you know, Boston worked its way. Yeah, and that became the predominant influence to it. You know?
Charles?
Yes, ma'am.
I guess I'm thinking about like Ruggles up in Columbia Falls.
Right.
Because there's Ruggles in Boston. And, you know, I'm just trying to figure out like who was actually living here during all this time.
Well, I mean, from 1763 on, I mean, the settlers they just kept coming in here. It's very interesting. I did a study of all the Gouldsboro deeds from 1763 on, and I inventoried all the names that are listed in there as living in Gouldsboro, and it's amazing how many of them didn't stay in there. They weren't. They moved further down east. They kept on going down east. So I mean, it was very fluid. It was because there was no real society here. You know, I mean, everything was dependent on lumber. You know, that was the source of the economy, and they fished for food. And of course, in the Revolutionary War, the problem was that you know the ships of the Royal Navy, especially the Viper, were right off the coast here, and so they couldn't get to Boston. The only way to get to Boston was by sea. Well, the Royal Navy was out there, wasn't going to let them through. And so, I mean, there was almost no food in a lot of places in this area, and it was, because it was just basic society. It was just frontier when the Revolutionary War came along. So that's why it was slower growing, you know, because it didn't even become British till 1763. So, I mean, but the population, you know, it's hard to nail down at any certain time who was in a certain place because it was very fluid and anything to make a living, you know. So, you know,
How do you think the War of 1812 affected Mainers' attitude toward Massachusetts?
well, now you're the authority on the War of 1812, not me. You're the one that did the paper on it. Well, I mean, technically speaking, Britain held eastern Maine from Castine east during the war, and but I mean, I don't know. I've never seen much about it. Taft, he was still living in Montville with his uncle before he moved to be with his mother and his mother's family here in Gouldsboro, and he was a soldier in the War of 1812. So I mean, there was some movement, but I mean, I don't think there was anything much really to take. You know, it was so new. It was all new in Eastern Maine. It was all kind of diffused, I think. So, sir.
The Taft you mentioned the same as Taft Point?
That's right. It's the same family. Yep, that's exactly right. Yep. Anything else?
Well,
Okay.
here's one for your growing collection. Archivist has put together some of the Taft family correspondence,
Oh, lovely.
which I don't think you've seen. So
I know, I haven't.
this is yours,
Goody, great.
and again, we really appreciate you
Oh, no, it's my
visiting
pleasure.
us
Oh,
every
this is
year.
great. I was telling Alan or Ken or somebody, I have, over the last few years, I have found about 7 or 8 Taft letters on eBay. And I got a couple of them in Southern California. One of them came from Arizona, one was in North Carolina, one was from Louisiana, from all over the lot, and it's just wonderful because it's the letters, not the business letters, but the family letters that give you a picture of the person.
That's the thing. That's what's hard to retrieve. You know, you can see a person's public life and all the major, you know, their birth and their marriage and their death and all this. But you know, who are these people? To me, that's what's fascinating about it. And the letters, that if you could retrieve letters, very often the letters will give you an indication of, you know, who they were as people rather than just, which is part of what I loved about these, when you put these three histories together. I mean, they're very different in a lot of ways. You know, and you can see gradually more and more and more as time goes by from being British subjects to being sister realm.